Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Did the killer of Karoline Jones leave a clue to their identity by her body? Find out on Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Brondesbury Villas in Kilburn, NW6. 3 roads south of Gemma Mitchell and the grisly suitcase of death. 4 roads northwest of Michael Dowdesell, the sadistic little drummer boy. 4 streets west of the ill-fated first assassination attempt by the so-called professional terrorist Carlos the Jackal. And 2 streets east of the fat dog who ate all the diamonds. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Just off the busy Kilburn High Road sits 21 Brondesbury Villas. A white, flat-fronted, semi-detached late Victorian townhouse on a quiet residential street, dotted with an occasional tree, but no signs of life. Unlike the other houses, its door isn't bedecked with a pretentious Doric column, but with all of them being identically built, every floor is slightly off. As with a set of steps taking you up to the ground floor, the bottom floor isn't below the earth, but halfway up, giving its occupants a brief hint of light once a day, a stunning view of the dog plops on the pavement, but mostly the right to call their grotty little basement flat lower ground, rather than the dungeon, the hellhole, the damp bit, the closet, or where Dad stashes his jazz mags. Back in 1940, this house was subdivided into 4 flats, with a couple in the basement, a family above them, a lodger on the top floor, and in the first floor maisonette, a woman whose life as a refugee, a widow, a mother, a loner, a recently released prisoner, and a career criminal was as mysterious as her death. Little is known about the motive for her murder, but with her last days alive well recorded, and a crime scene literally littered with evidence, the question we must ask is, did her killer leave a clue to his identity? My name is Michael, I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 336, Strange Last Days. The date was Wednesday the 10th of April 1940. 7 months after the start of World War II, and 5 months before the dreaded Blitz bombings, which decimated the city, causing 2 mass evacuations. As the Nazi hordes crept ever closer to our borders, with trepidation, life in the city moved on for now. The time was 10:15 a.m. when Alfred Scott, a surveyor for Bates & Co., and estate agents in Kilburn, rang the bell to the communal door at 21 Brondesbury Villas, but no one was in, as everyone was at work. On behalf of the landlord, 3 flats had been rented out. James and Saskia Goldborough lived in the basement, his father Henry, mother Jane, and sister Jane Jr. on the ground floor, and with a maisonette on the first and second. The attic had been sublet to Dutch national John van Giersdael, but he had moved out a month prior. And with 60-year-old German widow Karoline Jones, believed to have left with £20 rent owing, about £1,500 today, as was her habit, Alfred was here to check that she had gone. Unlocking the communal door, he rose up the stairs, and on the first floor he unlocked the maisonette door. There were 4 keys, one which John van Giersdael had returned to the estate agents when he left, the spare key which Alfred was using now, and 2 keys still held by Karoline and her son Frederick. Upon entry, nothing roused his suspicion, as all except for the fanlight above the door, every window was fastened, but there was clear evidence she hadn't been there for a while, but she hadn't left. The flat had 4 rooms. A lavatory, which was empty. A kitchenette, which had a stale slice of bread on the side, and a stack of dirty dishes, as the mains water had been off for a month. And 2 bedrooms. The front bedroom was empty. The bedsheets were messy, but they hadn't been slept in for months. In the wardrobe was a man's fedora hat, an ash walking stick, and a broken tennis racket, later confirmed to belong to Frederick, Karoline's son, whose room this was. And on the dressing table, a wireless radio, a penknife, and a set of keys which fitted the maisonette's Yale lock, as previously owned by Frederick. At that point, Alfred the surveyor for Bates & Co. had just one thought on his mind: how to evict them, as with no hint of foul play. Yes, the flat was messy, but what did he expect from a tenant like Karoline? It was then, with a shiver down his spine, that he stopped just shy of her bedroom door. It was open. Having inspected the premises before, he knew it was never open. As being a cautious and paranoid woman, given her past, a key had been inserted into the padlock from the outside. But before it was turned, the door had been forced, the wood had splintered, and the padlock scattered. As an ex-copper and a coroner's officer, Alfred knew to touch nothing, so he let his eyes scan the room before he ventured any further. With the room made dark as the windows were covered with blackout paper, he could see that the drawers of the dressing table were open and empty. But around it, women's clothes were scattered. A blue and white jumper, a blue nightdress, and 3 cotton handkerchiefs. When the room was searched, not a pound note nor a penny was found. But given how broke Karoline said she was, it's uncertain how much she actually had. As for her jewellery, 2 18-carat gold wedding bands, one with a diamond and one with a ruby, a gold watch, a 4-pearl brooch, and a gold slave bangle. All of them were missing, but as she was living off benefits and sleeping in hostels, it's uncertain if she'd already sold them. Further in, it was clear that a certain someone who'd broken in was looking for something specific. Perched on an armchair, her brown attache case containing her bills, letters and court summonses had been searched, but not finding what they sought, they grabbed a black Gladstone bag. With it locked, they frantically cut away the clasps using a small penknife, and desperate to find that one thing, they scattered its contents across the floor, sweeping aside anything which wasn't that one thing. Inside was toiletries, calling cards, her diary, containing mostly a list of lodging houses, estate agents, and rooms to let, and scraps of paper on which she'd scrawled the names and addresses of those she had met. But they'd left behind items of significant value: her passport, her National War Savings Certificate, her ration books, and 3 savings books for the Post Office, Abbey Road Building Society, and Lloyd's Bank. Whatever they were looking for, it's unlikely they found it, as Karoline had paid the ultimate price. The first thing that hit Alfred was the smell. A sulphurous stench of a body in active decay. Flies buzzed as the skin slipped, and maggots squirmed along the soft dark flesh. As with the body having bloated and then ruptured, it leaked a vile dribble of foul fluids out of every orifice, off the bed and onto the floor. And although a putrefied corpse was too horrific to look at, her death was obviously cruel and unnatural. She was lying on her back, diagonally across the bed, her legs hanging limply over the side. Except for a flower pot hat which lay by the door, her black leather shoes which had fallen off in the attack, and her gas mask case and string shopping bag which was still attached to her wrist, having just come in. She was fully dressed in the clothes she was wearing 21 days before. Yet her only injury was a bloody nose. With no defensive wounds and no signs of a struggle, to restrain her, her assailant had ripped up her tablecloth into strips. Her wrists and ankles had been bound to the iron frame of the bed. Her mouth had been gagged with a red woolen scarf, and with her unconscious, having been punched in the face. Her overcoat and her skirt had been raised up to the height of her hips, leaving her underwear exposed. But why? Examined at Kilburn Mortuary, the Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury confirmed she had no other injuries, that this was willful murder, that her cause of death was suffocation caused by the pillow found by her head. And although it looked as if she'd been raped or molested, she hadn't. So who had murdered Karoline Jones, and why? Karoline Getta Jones was born Karoline Liedermann on the 4th of March 1880 in Keinwallstadt, a small town in Bavaria, Germany. Little is known of her early life, except she first married aged 20 in 1900 to an unnamed German Jew. In 1908 they had a son called Frederick. Separating in 1909, she bigamously married again, but then was widowed in 1918. And then marrying Corporal John Howell Jones of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps in 1920. By 1930, the same year she became a British citizen, she was widowed. Her life could have been worse. As being a German Jew, by 1933, when the Nazis came to power, she was living freely in London, far from the horrors of the Holocaust. But her life wouldn't be without hardship. Hence she was infamously known to be gruff, foul-mouthed, unpleasant, and a habitual liar. Across her final decade, she amassed 5 criminal convictions which summed up her life's sad decline. In 1935 at Clerkenwell, with her flat having been raided by the police, she was fined £20 for running a brothel in Bloomsbury and was described as quarrelsome and disgusting. By 1937, having been evicted by her landlady for living in a squalid, filthy lodging in Stoke Newington, she was convicted twice in Soho and Marylebone for stealing a brooch, a tin of fruit, and a box of face powder. By 1938, living in King's Cross, she'd fled her lodging, leaving £6 in back rent, which she often did. 3 months later, she was sentenced to 6 months in prison for assault, a familiar trait for Karoline Jones. With no friends and very little family, as she persistently rubbed others up the wrong way, she lived by her wits on the breadline of poverty, and with very little to call her own, wherever she went, she hid her most precious items in specially sewn pockets she had stitched into her knickers and stockings. With her son Frederick married, but a Jew who was stuck in Nazi Germany, soaking her crumpled and worn clothes with a river of tears, she told anyone who would listen that she had £2,600, roughly £168,000 today, to smuggle him out of the country. And yet, as a refugee, he arrived in September, courtesy of a charity. On the 10th of October 1938, at Bates & Co., the estate agents on Kilburn High Road, she rented a 2-roomed maisonette at 21 Brondesbury Villas for herself and her son. It was cheap, squalid. She always reneged on the rent, leaving a litany of excuses and lies, and she was not liked by the tenants. In the basement, James and Saskia Goldbrew said she was rude, abusive. She stole their milk and their letters and deliberately banged the doors at night, keeping their children awake. Henry and Jane on the ground floor told the police that Karoline regularly fought with her son. He was seen with a black eye. She punched her sister and broke her brother-in-law's nose as the two stayed with her before both refugees fled to Palestine. And John Van Giersdaal, her lodger, left as he suspected that she was using her flat as a brothel. On the 14th of October 1939, at Marlborough Street Police Court, Karoline was sentenced to 6 months hard labour for stealing a hat from Selfridge's department store on Oxford Street. Serving a time at H&P Holloway before being transferred to H&P Aylesbury, she was disliked by the prisoners and officers alike. She was described as filthy, surly and obnoxious. She was repeatedly beaten up by fellow inmates, and she continually bragged about how she had a beautiful home in Kilburn and was wealthy with £2,600. And that's what made her murder impossible to solve. As she lied, and she wasn't liked. But who had murdered her? A friend, a relative, a potential rapist, a spectre from her past, or a complete stranger? The strange last days of Karoline Jones began on Friday the 15th of March 1940, 15 days before her death. 11 days before, she spent her 60th birthday in prison, and by the time she was released, there was no one there to greet her, as her son had left, having been enlisted into the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps. That day, Karoline caught a train from Aylesbury to Baker Street. And unwilling or unable to return to her flat at Brondesbury Villas, she met an adjutant of the Salvation Army, and she asked to be housed in a homeless hostel. She went to the flat, she packed her bags, but for whatever reason, she never arrived. She did the same over the next 2 weeks. She pleaded for a free bed at the Salvation Army hostel, but failed to show up. She instead paid 22 shillings, roughly £40, to kip for a week at the YMCA. She claimed to be destitute and seeking a handout from the Royal British Legion, appearing distressed, hysterical, and some said mentally unbalanced. But was she afraid of the streets, her flat, or somebody she knew? With her lodger and her son having moved out, she couldn't afford the flat, not that it ever stopped her. From her ripped open Gladstone bag, scattered across the floor beside her body, police found business cards and scraps of paper bearing the names and addresses of the places she'd applied to jobs for. And pleading that she was a refugee, which she wasn't, a widow, which she was thrice over, and homeless, which technically she wasn't. Many employers pitied her and gave her a hot meal. In her possession, she had both sets of keys to the flat, having refused to give them back. And with a bucket of chutzpah, even though she owed £20 back rent, on the 21st of March, 9 days before her death, she went to Bates & Co., the estate agents on the Kilburn High Road, and she insisted they reconnect her water. But she wasn't exactly broke. 3 days prior, at Abbey Road Building Society, she claimed that while she was in prison, someone had withdrawn £10, 7 shillings and 3p from her account, which could never be proven. That same day, she made some small withdrawals totalling about £13, and at the Unemployment Assistance Board in Park Royal, her benefits were denied as she had too much money. She had 1 shilling at the Co-op, £2 at Lloyd's, £19 at the post office, £400 in national savings certificates, and with shares from her 3 dead husbands, she was sitting on a fortune of £2,833, around £202,000 today, more than she'd lied about. She never wore her wealth and she never spent it, but some kind of plan was clearly brewing. Of the many names in diary entries found at the crime scene, one was to rent a room at 54 Shireland Road in Paddington. After much back and forth, on the 22nd of March, Karoline agreed to move in. She paid 15 shillings deposit. Then she said it was only to be used for storage, and instead she slept at a hostel. At the houses she looked at on Cleveland Gardens, Connaught Street, Sussex Gardens, Star Street and Prince's Terrace, all had previously been brothels. All required a £2,000 deposit to rent, and she even went as far as to find a disreputable man to go into business with her, but that opportunity collapsed. It's uncertain if this 60-year-old widow, described as filthy, uncouth and foul, was still working as a sex worker, as her lodger had claimed. But although she'd remained single ever since she'd been widowed, she often received 2 constant visitors to 21 Brondesbury Villas. One aged 40 to 45, 5'10", slim and wearing a taxi driver's cap, and another 30s, 5'6", stout with greasy hair. But none were ever identified. And as was typical of Karoline Jones, she also randomly assaulted strangers with no rhyme nor reason. On Saturday the 23rd of March 1940, just 1 week before her death, outside of 19 Brondesbury Villas next door, she asked a furniture removals man for his card and she requested the quote, but she never called him. And across the next 5 days, nothing is known about where she went or what she did. Until this. On Friday the 29th of March, the day before her death, she applied to be a maid at a house in Kensington. Unable to stand for long or move quickly owing to a recent knee operation, she didn't get the job, but claiming to be destitute, she made a big impression on the housekeeper who noticed her jewellery. 2 18-carat gold bands with a diamond and a ruby, a gold watch, a pearl brooch and a gold bangle. Hearing Karoline's plight, the housekeeper suggested that maybe she should sell them, but Karoline said she couldn't as they were of great sentimental value. Descriptions of every piece were circulated to every pawnbroker and jeweller in the area, but not a single item was ever found. Which brings us to Saturday the 30th of March 1940, her last day alive. There were only 2 sightings of her. At 1:30 p.m, when she left 21 Brondesbury Villas, carrying her black Gladstone bag and wearing the clothes she would die in. And at 5 p.m, when the housekeeper from the day before spotted her looking in the window of an antiques dealer's in Kensington. Where she went after that, who she met, what she did, and who she returned back to the flat with, remains unknown. Alerted by Alfred Scott, the surveyor for Bates & Co. On Wednesday the 10th of April 1940, officers arrived at 10:35 a.m. and Divisional Police Surgeon Dr. John Tweddle confirmed that she had been dead for 21 days. On the bed, her body lay with no defensive wounds or struggle, just a single punch to the face and she had been suffocated with a pillow. She'd been restrained by her ankles and wrists using ripped strips of tablecloth so her legs and arms were splayed, and gagged with a scarf as she was silent and immobile, as her killer had pulled up her skirt to her hips, her knickers exposed, but there was no sexual assault. Clearly the killer had a deep hatred for her, but what was his motive? A rape, a robbery, or a murder? With no witnesses to anyone entering or exiting the premises at the time of the death, detectives theorized she had either invited back someone she knew, or if she was still a sex worker, a customer. But given the fact that she had very little family and almost no friends, being abrasive and foul, we know it wasn't her sister or brother-in-law as they were in Palestine, or a son as he was serving in France. There were 4 sets of keys to the flat. Karoline's, which was found in the padlock, her son's Frederick, which was on the dressing table, 2 sets with the estate agent, one of which was used by Alfred Scott, and no others. Every current tenant or prior resident of the house was questioned, and with a recurring theme that nobody liked her. None of them disliked her enough to kill her, and they all had a solid alibi to prove it. With no scuff marks, cuts or abrasions, she had willingly ascended the stairs with her killer. Although what her intention was is unknown. As desperate to move out, the flat was empty, except for a few clothes which wasn't hers, a radio, a penknife, and some slices of stale bread. But it was as she bent over to unlock a bedroom door that they struck, splintering the lock before the padlock was removed. Based on the marks, she was likely dragged to the bed and punched in the face as she screamed. But the blood found on the sheets and underneath the restraints showed that she'd lain unconscious as her killer had ransacked the room. First was the drawers, but what was in there we don't know, as having been in prison for 6 months, many of her few belongings were still at the hostel, or in the Gladstone bag she'd carried in. The brown attache case was only lightly searched and given up just as quick. Next was the Gladstone bag, whose contents, business cards, letters, bank books, a diary, and scraps of paper with the details of those she'd met, scattered far and wide. So was the killer searching for something which identified them? Having come to, it's likely that she was bound and gagged before she struggled and screamed again, giving her assailant time to search the flat thoroughly. It's unlikely but unprovable that they took every note or coin found. And with her jewellery being too precious to sell, it was stripped from her. And although police found 2 sets of fingerprints inside the flat, they both belonged to Karoline and her son, and no one else. It was clear that a certain someone who'd broken in was looking for something specific. But what did they want from her? Her wealth? Unlikely, as her jewellery had more of a personal value than a monetary one. A hostel warden recalled that she got £10 in cash in her purse, about £300 today. And with only £20 in her bank account, her fortune of £2,833, roughly £202,000 today, was in national savings certificates and shares, which could only be accessed with a will, a next of kin, and a solicitor. But had they heard that she was wealthy and assumed it was in cash? If not, what did they want her for? Sex? Detectives thought not, as although she was previously a prostitute and a brothel keeper, it had all the hallmarks of a rape, as she'd been physically assaulted, knocked out cold, tied by her hands and feet to the bed, and with a coat and skirt rucked up around her hips. Someone wanted to see around her genitals. But with no semen, no penetration, and her underwear having not been removed, there was only one possible thing that they were looking for. Something she valued most. Karoline Jones had lived through hardship, poverty, homelessness, abandonment, and grief. Across the 60 years of life, she'd fled wars and persecution, and every time she'd moved from place to place, she always carried with her everything she held dear. Her jewellery on her fingers, her business affairs in an attache case, and her daily essentials in a Gladstone bag. But her most precious thing in the whole wide world, she had hidden in a series of specially sewn pockets she had stitched inside her knickers and stockings. She had told many about the fortune she had, but being a filthy, foul and poorly dressed woman who lived off handouts and slept in homeless hostels, as an inveterate liar, it's unlikely that anyone believed her. But this was the one thing she cherished so much that at all times she kept it close to her skin. And this was her secret. But did she tell someone? Did they find out? And if so, who were they? It wasn't a friend or family member. It wasn't a punter or a prosy in the sex trade. It wasn't someone she'd stiffed on a business deal, or an opportunist thief who thought this frail old lady was an easy mark. In fact, it was someone who hated her since the first day they met her. And most likely, it wasn't a man. On the 14th of October 1939, Karoline was sentenced to 6 months hard labour, which she served at female-only prisons, H&B Holloway and then H&B Aylesbury. Inside, Karoline was hated by prisoners and staff alike. She was rude, obnoxious, surly, and on several occasions in the yard, she was attacked by a specific prisoner who truly hated her. A 27-year-old woman, her name redacted, with a rap sheet for drunkenness, larceny, and procuring an abortion, as well as violence and assault. Karoline was the target of her venom for months. And then it stopped, and she became Karoline's pal. She later denied this, but the other prisoners said she was. She denied knowing where Karoline lived, but the other women said they too had been invited to stay. She denied being told about the £2,600 that Karoline had blabbed about to anyone who would listen, and yet others said they heard about it but didn't believe it. But what of her secret? The one thing that was so precious she had stitched into secret pockets in her knickers. She told no one about that, ever. But upon her reception at HMP Aylesbury, as was standard, she was stripped of her own clothes, and her personal effects were searched and listed. Every pocket was checked for weapons and contraband, especially any covert pouches in her pants. She had no reason to tell anyone, but one of the warders will have known, and they all hated her. When interviewed, the unnamed prisoner denied being in Kilburn, hating her, or meeting Karoline after her release. And when she was told of the murder, detectives said she seemed genuinely surprised. With no evidence against her, she wasn't charged or questioned further. But was this what happened?